All right. So thank you, Amos, again for the introduction. I'm going to be talking about digital and what it means to collect data for assessment, evaluation, and all the way to interventions in the future. So there's a lot of acronyms around that, DHTs, DTX, PDTX, but I think they are distinctly different, and I want to be focusing on a little bit of that. Here are my disclosures. I've been lucky to have partnered with various organizations in the past. So some of the learnings and metadata that I'll present comes from various other collaborations. None of the data that I'm talking about today is from any Biogen projects, and I need to say that. And all opinions are mine. So today I'm going to be broadly talking about these three case studies at a very high level. So my apologies up front that I will not be double clicking on a lot of details, but happy to discuss any other things in the Q&A. Before we go into the nitty gritty, let me bring you up all on the same page. I'm also assuming this crowd is well versed in digital technologies. So it should not, I don't need to cover all the details. So that's where I give you some context. This is very important. We are talking a lot about digital in the sense of what happens when the data is collected, how do we generate evidence, what is associated with daily behavior, etc. And hopefully that sustains or holds and is robust enough for deployment in the field in the future. That's really important to understand that we are capturing it in a real world context, and AI can sometimes get it wrong, right? So this is the picture. This is my context. So that's where I am on spring break right now with my kid. And the reason I'm showing this picture is not because I want to highlight that I'm at Disney, but more about I've had a fascinating experience trying to look at the app that they have. There are thousands and thousands of people that visit the park every day, and navigating on which service or which ride you want to access has been flawless. And I'm coming back after 5-7 years, and the app looks very, very distinctly different. And I think that's where digital health needs to be, to a level where patients, providers, people, participants can slickly interact with the solution of the system that we all are envisioning or building. So the things that I will share today is sort of coming from that direction. I'll start by saying, and if some of you have had the misfortune of hearing me in the past, there will be some common slides, but they really are important and matter to me a lot. So this is really important to understand, like, getting and understanding someone's emotional life is very challenging. And this comes from Emil Kraepelin, who's a famous German psychologist. I highly recommend everyone read this book if you are interested in behavioral psychology, Manifestations of Insanity. And he, 100 years ago, said we really don't have any objective yardstick to assess someone's sort of emotional life, and how we look at someone's internal phenotype versus external and what they are saying versus not saying is challenging. Today, I'm not going to be talking about results from research studies from assessing outcomes. I'm going to be talking more about how people use those technologies. But at the 10,000 feet level, the view is, as we all are working towards, is where the digital comes in the usual health research and care settings. And like I said earlier, there's a continuum spectrum from technology-based assessment, diagnosis, and how do you manage someone, treat, prevent. And then there's the absolutely important aspect of transitioning some of the research to care, and how does it become regulated and who is reimbursing. And now that I work at a more regulated industry in pharma, that also matters a lot. And so there's a lot of question, as Amos was sort of nicely articulating when introducing me, is what, who, why, when, how much. These are really important to understand. Some of you might have seen the unfortunate sort of news on peer therapeutics recently, and it all relates to that, like technology for what purpose, how much, who will pay for it, etc. So before we go into the details, at a high level, I do believe that there is a lot of potential in how we use this ecosystem in just-in-time meaningful assessment and intervention in healthcare settings, especially in the real world. This is a slightly detailed sort of infographic here, but one can learn a lot from behavior, passive and active, and I don't think this crowd needs to know more, but what I'm going to emphasize is You can also look at individualized trajectories of health, broadly speaking, and how someone might be at risk at a prodromal stage or have a disease symptoms that are more significantly becoming or surfacing up. And those could be used for just-in-time assessment, and they could be online interventions. So the goal, the way where the field wants to go is very clear, but I think we have to think about how do we get to complete this broader picture. And this is non-exhaustive, right? So some of you might be thinking more broadly in many different ways, but this is my 10,000 feet view of it, especially in the mental health. However, this is where I think there's a pause required is DHTs will need to be very carefully assessed, evaluated for what claims they are making with regards to the underlying disease and the target population that they are trying to make an impact on, right, in a positive way. So that is really important on the data that we collect is representative of that target population. Nothing surprising, hopefully, on that side. Um, Again, at a very high level, and a lot of you folks are working on that, I guess, is you collect real world data by creating a study, deploying apps into smartphone, compliance, analyze data, generate evidence, etc. In reality, there's a lot more going on here. And I know some of you personally are working on many of these specific things, right? But I can give a separate detailed talk on all these buckets. However, at a high level, there are 6 or 7 areas that are really important in all of this. I'm going to double click on some of these today, not all of it, because that's going to be outside the scope. So, for example, data ecosystem, right? I think about it in 3 C's. So the creation, the curation, and the consumption of the data. And the radar platform is a perfect example of that, right? Like, how do you think about where data is created? What's the provenance? How do you curate data? And how do you consume it in a responsible way? Excuse me, I also have a bad throat. Those are really key things. And they come up again and again in real world evidence generation on what's the context here. Remember, I told you context when we started earlier. Where is the data coming from? Why is it missing? What's going on? And who do we have in the data represented and who do we don't? And that means a lot. And why is we are asking people to participate in decentralized remote trials as part of their daily lives. So this is not a brick and mortar setting where people are coming into a clinic and give us that 15, 20 minutes or an hour. We are asking them to participate as they go about their daily lives, and there might be a lot happening. Someone will be traveling, sick, party, vacation, etc. And so we need to think about all the context. And this is where, again, I'll bring the Disney example. Their app is smart enough to know when I'm near a ride, is smart enough to know when I've exited the park. And of course, there's also a lot of privacy things that you need to tell the app in order for app to be smart enough. But it provides a clear value proposition for the user. And I think that's key. Why am I saying all this, right? So our intent on most of the studies in decentralized, why we think digital can bridge the divide in healthcare is we can reach a wide target population, a diverse population, and assess them over time, understand what is the underlying sort of etiology in the real world setting for various disease and health concerns. However, as we have seen in multiple studies that I'm going to share in a couple of minutes, the reality is something like this, where there is non-uniform, that's the key, there's a non-uniform attrition of people from these studies that is disproportionately impacting how we collect data. I'm making a broad statement here, and it might be somewhat provocative, but that's broadly speaking, we don't expect a uniform attrition across the socio-demographic characteristics or even social determinants of health characteristics. And I'm going to show you some data on that aspect. And there are ways to address that. Okay, this is incredibly important from a medical product development perspective. FDA is now requiring diversity plans for clinical trials going forward in the US. And so there's a lot at stake in how we understand, design these studies. But I'm going to make another provocative statement here. It's not just enough to have a diverse population recruited in a study. We need to think about how they will be retained through the course of the observation period. So if you enroll an amazing diverse sample at the start of your clinical trial and your readout is in 2 years, they might not all stick around for the same time. And so that's where some of the work I started doing a couple of years ago is how do we understand who is in these studies for how long. I'm going to show you some sort of high level summaries from that. This is unfortunately my own hand a couple of years ago. I use it very often, this picture, and this should not be acceptable to anyone, right? And there are multiple such pictures floating around. And part of the reason is the PPG signal that is taken from this device and how it's sort of featureized to generate heart rate is biased, right? I'm a brown skin guy, and you can see the heart rate is off by 30 plus basis points here. That should not be acceptable. That makes no impact in healthcare. In fact, it confuses people more. So we started looking at it from a high level perspective in one of the first papers that looked at about 8, I think, decentralized studies, including the top 5 health kit-based studies that some of us did in collaboration with Apple. And there are a lot of learnings. I'm going to give you a high-level summary of it. At least in that sample, which is non-exhaustive and non-representative of all the studies, but it was one of the first larger studies, we saw a significant disproportionately representation in US, where if you can sort of follow this graph, the higher means that the overrepresentation and lower, the lighter color means underrepresentation. And you can see if you are an obesity researcher, you should be really worried about this because people who are deeply impacted in certain part of the country in US are up to 40% less likely to participate in these trials. That's a problem. And of course, that's associated, not causative, but that's associated with mortality, with median income, and so on and so forth. These are just a couple of SDOH, social determinants of health. There are a bunch of other learnings. I'm going to spare you with all of that, but at least zoom in on one, which is very promising. We saw a significant advantage, at least in this sample, where clinicians who referred the patients to the study, that's the purple line, compared to people who came by themselves or all comers. There was a significant difference in how they engaged in the study. And by the way, these are survival plots. So the y-axis is survival probability, and the x-axis is duration in the study. It's a very small observation period of 12 weeks here. So when I show you some of the slides later, you will see some more longer observation period as well. So this is the high-level sort of summary. I'm going to now show you 3 specific use cases or examples from some of the recent studies. This one is from Radar. So I had the pleasure of working closely with Yezu, Amos, Richard, and many others. I think some of you are in the audience. So thank you for the opportunity. And this is joint work, by all means, led by Yezu. So the condition here is depression. And I don't think I need to explain the Radar MDD sample to all of you here. But what I'm going to say is we showed the community for the first time on how real-world data collection could be impacted by a couple of things, including condition. What do I mean? This, for the first point, I'll highlight that the data here is showing a huge difference in how people could be engaged over long term. This is unprecedented in terms of comparing it to various US studies. So if you look at the x-axis, we have 300 days observation period or up to 600 days. And broadly speaking, across active, passive data modalities coming from phone and wearable, which is Fitbit, we have over 50% compliance. And that's huge. I mean, I just want to point that out first. The paper goes into more detail on some of the factors that the team employed and how people could be engaged more with human in the loop and so on, and co-designing. But I'm going to talk from a different perspective. This picture shows a lot of what is possible and feasible, which is great. But if you look at the other side, so the colors are the same here. I'm showing the active data from the phone, the passive from the phone, and the pink is the Fitbit. It's a different kind of a look at this data, slicing it over time with y-axis being the participants and x-axis being the observation day from 0 to or day 1 to day 300 in this case. You can see there is a lot of dense pink, which is where the Fitbit data comes, or orange or darker yellow, which is the phone passive. But you also see some sparsity, which is not bad, it's expected. And not everyone will comply the way you want them to. But what is fascinating to see is how the social demographic factors or social determinants of health could be different across these different factor clusters, namely C1 to C3. There are many examples. I'm going to show you just one. If you look at the baseline depression severity across these three clusters shown by the bar plot on the side, there is a up to 4 points median on an average difference between the depression severity for the C1 versus C3. What do I mean? People in the C3 cluster that were least likely to share data in this scenario, it's a real world study, right? Were up to 4 points high, had a 4 points higher score on the PHQ-8 compared to people who were in the C1 cluster. Does that mean it's true for every disease severity study? No. In this particular study, we saw such effect, and something to think about in the future on how we have just-in-time sort of engagement interventions to do something more to get data from the people who are likely more severe, have severe disease symptoms. But I don't mean to say it should be generalized. Here's the second one. This paper came out a couple of weeks ago, actually, so it's pretty recent. It's from the ABCD study, which is the nationally representative of the healthy kids in US. It's about 10,000 plus kids. The data collection is ePros and wearables, which is Fitbit. The observation period is really small in this case, about a couple of weeks. And the story sort of remains constant, right? Which is what I'm trying to re-emphasize here. Rather than read each plot, kids who are coming from lower socioeconomic household, whose parents were less educated, who were Black or minority, were significantly less engaged in the study. And I'm not talking statistical significance here, I'm talking the effect size. And in a 3-week observation period, you can see already the slope is significantly different and effect sizes are meaningful. And if this were to be a longer observation period, we will have a much significantly higher delta in terms of the effect sizes. You can also see the total wear time of Black kids versus white kids in terms of the wearables. And again, the point is not that it's white versus Black. It's about the devices that are worn by the Black kids are the wear time on that is significantly different, and we need to really understand what's going on. And clearly, there is signals showing there is impact of socioeconomic factors. The location of the sites, there were 21 odd sites from which these participants were recruited. There is also a pretty significant difference in which parts of the country the sites are located in, and it's going in the same direction. If you remember the geospatial plot I showed you earlier, it's showing similar kind of trends. Pandemic was also very interesting. So people, at least in this study, who were recruited during the pandemic wore their devices significantly less compared to the pre-pandemic period. We don't have the post, so it's not really a causation here. But something to think as we think about data collected during pandemic, is that true wear time or is already impacted by the lockdowns, right? So that all context, again, context can make a difference there. So this is the same plot showing wearable data for different participants, 10,000 odd. So, and you can see, as this is a short observation period, that the C2, C3, C4 clusters, they all have less amount of wear time. And you can see C4 cluster where it's like they did not wear the device properly in the beginning. There was some human in the loop intervention, and then the device was worn properly, etc. So there's a lot we can learn from the metadata that may or might not impact the clinical outcomes of interest, but could help us collect data in a more robust manner. Here's the last one. This is on part of this is published, partly it's not. So this is a DARPA-funded study that I was part of for a couple of years. We collected data from up to 10,000 people, generally healthy population with bring your own device and active and passive, so both Android and iOS. Again, I don't need to tell you all these details, but there's a lot of data that could be collected, right? And which we did. It's a kitchen sink study, right? And I would not recommend doing similar approaches in the future because we were trying to learn what could be collected. But there are concerns about why we should collect everything, right? But what I'm trying to show here today would be, we asked a simple question: if you collect axle gyro GPS and more from iOS and Android, how similar is the underlying data profile based on completeness, correctness, and consistency? Why is it important? If you were to come up with a gait detection algorithm in Parkinson's or many other diseases, and you were to deploy it in the field for Android, for users who have Android and iOS phones, you would want the results to be same. Just like when you sit in an Audi or a Kia or any other car, a mile is a mile. The mile doesn't change depending on the brand, right? So the signal should not change depending on the brand, but it does. So if you look at a sample of 3,000 individuals in both iOS and Android, and if you look at the underlying signal for axle gyro and GPS, it's significantly different. In fact, it is more than 90% accurate just to detect the device differences by itself. So this is a PR curve showing. So by the way, this part is not fully published, so take it with a grain of salt. The accuracy with which we can detect the device difference itself by sensor data is more than 90%. Is it bad story? No. We need to understand what's the underlying shift in distributions, and so we can adjust that across devices. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. I'm not really showing you different versions of the Android, different versions of the iOS or iPhones over time. So there's a lot more that needs to be done here, but it shows the data, early data shows that we need to address this in a very, very systematic manner. What does it all mean? Context really matters. I've been emphasizing this today. What is being collected when, by whom, why, what's the burden, who's asking it for what purpose. Remember, I talked to you about the clinical referral versus people who are coming by themselves. How is the device collecting the data? Is it socially affordable? When are you asking people to complete surveys? Who share the data for how long? Obviously, that matters. I showed you a lot of examples on that. We really need to be proactive in sort of understanding how we could use just-in-time data-driven approaches to make meaningful adjustments so as to improve the data quality and robustness, but not to change the clinical or impact the clinical outcomes. That's really important. Otherwise, your study would be biased. I'm going to skip this one. So the take-home message on this is underrepresentation of certain populations in the data that we are collecting will make the evidence that we generate from that data inapplicable to those who were not included or were somehow left out, right? So it's really important to think through before we run association or predictive analysis, and what are the boundary conditions where it makes sense and where it needs to stop and say, I don't know enough about you, so I will not tell you anything about you. I'm going to skip this slide. We are short on time. The other aspect of this, which there's a lot of work going on with many of my colleagues in the field, is as we collect a lot of these data, the people's perception, and mind you, perception really matters, and their acceptance of what they're willing to share, and the providers, so doctors, what they're willing to use is really important. So today I don't have a time to show a lot of work on that, but there's a lot going on in here to understand the human factors and how the real world settings in hospitals and providers are willing to use this kind of data for future research or work. Really, we need to move from a lot of options to a simplified version. This is a picture I took in one of my Airbnb stays during the COVID time, and I never used the first two remotes. I only used the last one. we need to improve how we design this so people can consume it in a much simpler, slicker way. Finally, I don't think it's about getting a kitchen sink to deploy all the measures. We need to think deeply about what is our disease of interest, what's the symptom burden, what's the functioning that we're trying to understand, clinical outcome of interest, accordingly design the data that needs to be collected. And there's a lot of papers in this regards which talk about verification of the invalidity of the selected data streams, how they change over time, what's the plan for reaching target population, how much data do you want to collect for how long, what's the data governance and privacy. These subtle but important point really impact people's perception of the study at the very least. And so we need to be very careful about how we sort of communicate this and design the studies. I know there's a lot of things I'm presenting at high level. I'm almost done. So in summary, I think as we think about digital, I think about digital to measure something that is meaningful to the end users. And our y-axis here shows a lot of work that many of us are doing, right? How can this data stream or streams could be associated with certain disease outcomes or phenotype. But I think we need to think about this as we go from home to clinic measurement on how some of these measures, technologies are biased or could be biased, and what does it mean to address that? And it's okay to do just an Apple study or Apple Watch study. We need to be very clear on how that could be learning things from a certain population and leaving the others out. We need to be very clear about it. And so I think as we think about moving from some of the generalized episodic subjective measures to more continuous objective, we need to be contextualizing that in the micro, meso, and macro level of how these technologies are used or perceived in the real world settings. Finally, there's a lot of need to know here by different stakeholders, what patients need to know, what clinicians need to know, how payers will think about covering some of these in the future. So I'm sort of shifting from digital assessments for research to digital that could be used in healthcare settings. And that's where I think these points become even more pertinent in how we use them all together. Now I'm going to read all of it today. And with that, thank you so much for your time.